So all original languages before the advent of writing were largely action-based and verbal, not weak like the sun is rising or the man is speaking, but rising sun, speaking man, all together like as one word. Ancient languages were highly verbal. Ancient Chinese showed this directly through its ideograms. The Chinese ideogram for journey is king plus dog on ship sailing. So it's an ideogram of a sailing ship with a king and a dog on it, which in one symbol clearly and directly shows so much, whereas modern phonetic languages show so little, really nothing, and written words have no meaning outside of their sounds. Could we reinvigorate language with ideograms and a reverbalization? Example, in English king, but in Chinese you have the symbol for yeah, you all can see it.
I can see
One
it.
in Chinese is a single horizontal line, which also means earth. Two in Chinese are two horizontal lines and also means heaven. Three in Chinese are three horizontal lines and also means man, i.e. thing between earth and heaven. King is three horizontal lines with a vertical line running down the middle, namely the intermediary between earth and heaven.
Oh, nice.
So the question is, could we?
Yeah, the nice thing about that kind of thing is, I'm sure it doesn't apply that much to all of the ideograms, but that one communicates cosmology and metaphysics in a sense, without requiring it to be in a philosophical treatise.
Well, in Chinese, the words, the various meanings are connected by their pictorial representation. Whereas in the European languages, the connection of words is represented by their likeness in verbal or sound origins.
Sure, but if you look at something like that Chinese ideogram, you see heaven and earth and intermediary and the connection between them all in one symbol. And to understand the ideogram is to learn something about levels of reality. That's pretty cool.
I know, but in fact, most people in the West are quite familiar with geometric representations of truth. And
I know about that.
Right. Well, I mean, what you pointed out is understood by almost every perennialist.
Oh, well, yeah.
I mean,
that's true. I mean, but the point is that without, needing to talk about such things, the ideogram preserves the symbol in an intelligible way. And
yes, but
not need say very much to explain it.
But
it's like to give the etymology on one of our words might take longer than to describe that.
But the Chinese may have very little understanding of the cadence and of poetry and its rhythmic and rhyming characteristics, which is very, very much in the Western languages.
Well, they have a spoken language. They've got to have poetry.
Well, actually, that's not really accurate, because probably the Chinese have one of the longest, most highly developed forms of poetry in the world. Does it use exactly the same forms? Of course not. But it has, if anything, much more of a focus on internal rhyme, rhythm, pulse, these sorts of things than classical English poetry, specifically because it hasn't been based so much around some artificial notion such as line ending rhyme. And in fact, the English poetry hasn't always been focused on rhyme. I mean, for instance, in the Middle Ages, there were a lot of alliterative poets, which I honestly like to a large extent a lot better than the rhyming poets. Now, in Italian, you can do amazing things with rhyme. And because there's so many ways to rhyme in Italian, it doesn't get boring. But if you, if you try to read some of, Longfellow, Hiawatha and whatnot, it gets real boring, real fast. And,
Arabic doesn't get real boring real fast, and it's a phonetic language.
What doesn't?
Arabic.
Oh, well, it's got a little bit more in its more to its words, but it has common.
We're talking about the difference between not necessarily European developments, but between the phonetic languages of the world and the pictorial ones.
Yeah, well, maybe the pictorial ones.
I don't want to eliminate either.
No, I wouldn't either.
No, I wouldn't. But around the turn of the last century, English poetry became rather, dead in many respects. It was very formalistic and had lost a lot of its verve. And, more than anything else, what really put back life into English poetry for some period until people realized they were too lazy and it's too hard, was actually mining the riches of other languages. So, Ezra Pound basically turned English poetry into Chinese and Japanese poetry for the English speaker. I mean, his stuff is amazing. And on the other hand, you've got Basil Bunting, who did the same thing as Pound, but he incorporated Persian and Arabic elements, or T.S. Eliot, Sanskrit. And it was fantastic. And they all issued rhyme, but, there's no such thing as free verse. They weren't rhyming, but there was form and substance to what they were writing. Sure. Unfortunately, after the 1950s, you had a revolution again in poetry where they said, we don't need no stinking form and we don't need no stinking substance. And so now we're at where we're at.
Well, yeah, I was wondering if the ideographic languages, Chinese in particular, if it rhymes conceptually in its poetry, rather than phonetically. It
is analogous between the form of the visual form of the words. They are analogous to each other, and they are understood in that way.
Exactly. And there's such a thing as a visual rhyme. And when someone's, let's say, reading Pound's cantos, and they're confused. Oh, wait, here I'm reading something and there's some English followed by some Greek and then a Chinese ideogram and a Japanese ideogram, and I don't understand it. And, his own father was asking him, how do I do this? And he said, read it aloud and pay attention to how it looks like you're looking at a painting. And, there's a true poem, a poem like that needs a person to focus not just on, reading it like prose, but paying attention to the pictorial representation of how it looks on the page, and also to how it sounds read aloud. And that's something, certainly reading it aloud is something that we have in English. I mean, if you read, let's say, the alliterative poetry of, Langland, Pierce Plowman, that certainly, was something meant to be read aloud prior to many people having literacy. But much more in the East Asian tradition, we actually have poetry on the page that, of course, sounds good read aloud, but it also pays attention to form on the page.
Right.
So
most
that,
of the
yeah.
work I read about of Chinese who talk about the beauty of a poem by some ancient Chinese person, it's not how it sounds, it's how it looks.
Or it could be both, but yeah.
It could be both.
And you know, and because it's known that most of the people who are within the geographic area of China don't necessarily speak languages that they can understand audibly, but they can certainly understand their written form.
So there's a difference, I know, between Mandarin in sort of northern China and Cantonese in southern China, but they use the same, I don't know, alphabet or ideogram.
Yeah, they could read the same paper.
You could read Cantonese even if you didn't speak it, I think.
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I keep thinking of the distinction between written language and spoken language. I mean, spoken language came first, so. But I mean, there is a difference, and I do recall reading or hearing years ago that in Chinese, you can have a word which uses, let's just say, the same syllables, you know, consonants and vowels, and yet, let's say you have 3 syllables, but that the difference in pitch could produce a totally different word, totally different meaning.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Correspondence between the two, other than the way they look.
Right. There's actually 4 pitches. But one other interesting thing is that unlike traditional European languages, which are highly inflected, the traditional Chinese, for instance, is almost completely lacking, or maybe completely lacking in inflection. So it's entirely getting its meaning not on the morphology of a word, because there is no morphology. It's based on syntax. And one of the reasons why, you know, certain poets in the last 100 years felt that the perfect source to reinvigorate English was Chinese is because English used to be an inflected language and stopped being an inflected language, but Chinese for 3,000 or 4,000 years wasn't inflected, and so they learned how to work within that to develop a rhythm in terms of syntax, rather than, you know, focusing on changing the words and stuff. So I mean, in German, as long as the verb is sort of at the end, you can do a lot with rearranging things.
Yeah, as long as you can determine the case and tense from the letters in the word, you can.
How old is Sanskrit?
Pretty old.
There is one of the most highly inflected languages there is.
True.
Sanskrit, highly inflected. Could somebody help remind me what does inflection actually mean? Give some examples of it.
It means the modification of the word by
its grammatical
endings and predictable beginnings and so on and so forth.
So you
but based around a root word. Arabic also is that way.
Yeah.
And most of there's a lot of very heavily inflected languages that are very ancient. So I'm curious as to where the information is coming from that they weren't.
Wait, that wasn't. What wasn't?
That these languages like Sanskrit at one time or another came from something that was not inflected.
Well, I never said that. I just said that Chinese wasn't inflected.
Right.
That's right. But I think that these represent, these 2 language systems or ways represent a basic difference in the way the people think to some extent.
Yeah, that
One
could be.
thinks in terms of pictures, and the other thinks in terms of sounds. and they have their languages are developed along those lines. Also, their capabilities are to somewhat bounded by the way they think. And so you might say that when Chinese people come to be educated in the West, they don't pick poetry as their subject matter. They pick mathematics, okay?
Oh, sure.
And geometry. And that's because that is much more easily useful to them because of the way they think.
There's a nice thing about the ideograms is that you don't have to be so bound or involved in time in order to put the meaning together. But the spoken language and the inflected languages, you have to wait through time to see how it all fits together, especially in German, the suspense of the verb. But yeah, I mean, you don't need time. I mean, your eyes move and that takes some time, but yeah, I think there's less of a bondage to time in ideographic language, in the experience of it. As soon as you speak it, you're in time, but that's different.
I was just recalling learning to read as a first grader, where they had these picture books, and they'd say, "This is Dick and Jane, a little boy and a girl. This is Spot. Spot is a dog. See Spot run." You'd have a picture of a running dog. And
I had the same kind of teaching. The first word in the course was look, and the next word was see. And then it was see Spot run, I think.
Run.
Then they started getting really complicated with see Spot run.
So how do they teach Chinese, I wonder?
Verbally.
And I'd say that for the Chinese, it might be more difficult to deal with temporal constructs. I don't know. Because you say it's an advantage to the Chinese language that it is not dependent upon time, but it's also to the disadvantage of someone who is dependent on time to express temporal things.
If this happened in the past, and this I'm thinking will happen in the future.
Exactly.
Those are useful.
Well, yeah, I'm not talking about a sense of past and future. I'm just talking about spoken language necessarily unfolds in time sequentially. And even though you look at the ideograms sequentially, they don't actually require any time in the same way to, put them into your consciousness.
Do you want to know something that'll blow your minds?
Sure, do it, please.
The ancient Chinese word, and I think modern as well, but the ancient Chinese word for cat, mao, and the ancient Greek word for prey, i.e. the thing that the cat goes after, meow.
That's the prey. The meow is the prey, but the word
in ancient Greek.
Yeah.
And then mao, like with the tone, like basically meow, is cat in ancient Chinese.
Yeah.
Because of its tonality.
Right, because of tonality, and I can't hope to come close to it. But I think, how nice is that? I mean, what relation does cat have to a cat? Whereas meow is exactly what a cat does. Mm-hmm. It's clear, it's direct, it's simple.
Yeah. Well, I think, I've read stuff that hints that the earliest languages were not only onomatopoetic, but also relied upon more physical performance with more gestures and postures. I don't know if that's actually true, but it's a wonderful theory.
Well, there are people who use gestures a lot more than others.
Oh, well, true, but the
speakers tend to,
Yes, but the words generally convey enough of the meaning that they don't, need the embellishment. But I was talking about very early language where to describe a scene, you might use words and performance.
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes sense because originally all languages were verbal, they were oral. And the ancient Chinese ideogram for speech is actually the ideogram for man with a flame coming out of its mouth.
Well, at any rate, it's according to the Islamic tradition, Adam was given the name of everything, every manifestation. And were those names visual or were those names auditory?
I don't know, but he was between heaven and earth when it was given.
And let's say, right. So I don't think that one is somehow or another. You certainly shouldn't be basing the value of the language, because it seems to come from a time where people were more ignorant. And I don't think that's true. I think that from the very beginning, the words were there, and they were probably, people migrated to some who were more visually oriented and some who were more auditory oriented. But that's...
Yeah, but if you're going to speak to someone, before you even have writing, you're going to use sounds. And perhaps, as I say, some gestures and things like that.
No, you're assuming that their ignorance of things like that came first. And I say that's not true. I think they lost their knowledge of the angelic language, and they descended from the Tower of Babel, but being unable to understand each other.
Well, those stories are just that. They're stories. They're not the literal truth.
But they are useful, but they are stories.
Who said? Who says?
Who says they're history?
I think that they actually have an origin that is correct.
Well, I think they have a historical origin, but I'm not sure it's literally that the story conveys all the details. I think it maybe just conveys the significance.
Well, the Tower of Babel, what is that story?
That's about the
what actually happened.
Well, we don't know what actually happened. I won't say that the story of the Tower of Babel didn't happen.
That people started building something, and
yeah, but we don't have any way to verify it. But the meaning is there in the story.
Well, I'm not going to make the assumption that the assumption that evolution makes, that everything grew out of these infinitesimal particles. And
we can't verify that either.
Say that it didn't come from intelligence to begin with, from God.
Of course it did. Of course it did. I mean, if there's form, there's some intelligence behind it. You could put it that way. I don't know. We're in the realm of the inexpressible, but you know what I mean.
Well, one difference between modern religion and ancient religion is that if you look to the ancient writings and commentaries on the ancient poems and texts, basically no one was such an exoterist as to believe that the stories literally meant what they said. So when you had someone commenting on the plays or the mysteries or Orpheus going into the underworld or any of the story of Ovid's Metamorphoses, they're very clear that these things are there to present a meaning, and they describe interior states, not literal happenings at some point in history.
Yeah.
The interior
and not only that, but
states, when understood, are above these artifices that you're talking about of language. Okay. And they depict understandings which are beyond the expression of either Chinese or Western languages.
Right, but truth is outside of time, and the emphasis on history is a particular Abrahamic. Yeah.
And I just want to make myself clear. I'm not trying to say one language is better than another language. No. I'm simply trying to say that modern English has become incredibly degraded and that I was asking if maybe we could mine traditional languages to help to get some spunk back into it.
Well, if you could capture them in a reliable fashion before the Chinese communists get through with them.
Well, it's not only that, it's that we've become so literalistic, and we live in what would be called the tyranny of nouns. I believe that's one that I've heard.
That's one of Sheikh al-Bashir's favorite expressions, I think.
Yeah, it comes from somebody else, but he uses it a lot. But, we talk about things, and people have always talked about things, but the idea that nothing moreism philosophy that, it's just, it's literal. Even ordinary, what do they call it? The Christians, they don't talk about symbol. They talk about, I can't remember. But anyway, it's something more than the literal words.
Right.
Well, I would say that's more a reflection of the people who are using those particular parts of the language. Because if you look at English, if you look at all of what has been inherited from Latin, you will find that most of that is not about literal things, it's about ideas.
Sure, but that's not...
Okay, what is the spirit? What is the word spirit supposed to be? It's not supposed to be an object of like mud pie or something.
It's supposed to be ephemeral, like the wind or the breath.
Yeah, so I'm saying that the people, when you find more parts of the English language that have devolved to things, you have more or less seen what a limitation of the mental scope of the human beings involved that you have taken it to. And that doesn't mean that everyone should be following them to this point.
It's not inherent in the English language that happens. It's just a degradation over time that I think we can all observe.
And I think that a visual language, like what the Chinese communists have turned their language into, is just as edifying as is what we have turned ours into.
Well, I don't know. As long as they're ideograms, they're openings to something. But I don't know. I don't know what the communists have done to their language. I'm sure they haven't done it any favors.
But Fenollosa, who was writing in the late 1800s and largely writing about the traditional languages, but he said, that every word is not based on an object, it's based on movement, it's based on
verbs.
A verb. The verb takes priority. You obviously can't have a language without nouns and verbs, but whereas, modern Western languages make the verbs subject to the nouns, in the ancient Chinese and Japanese, it was reversed. So the nouns were subject to the verbs.
Yeah, and in Arabic, all the roots are represented as verbs.
Right, and additionally, he made the point that if you go back to the most ancient forms of Greek, for instance, in let's say Heraclitus, Pantare, you would have it saying, all is flux, not flux is all is flux. And that's been backed up by theoretical physics. All is energy. It's placing the verb, the action, as the primary thing. It's not saying that energy is in all. It's not a quality of the noun, but that everything that exists is energy or its flux or its soul or whatever it is. It's ultimately...
Well, flux is a good word because
Yeah.
it is verb derived.
Yes.
Well, you're just talking about the difference between two different levels of thought. We have the corporeal domain, which is primarily a description of some object that is conceived of being outside of the spatial, outside of the temporal order. And so, you know, you have, so if you talk about corporeal things, you are in fact talking about objects. If you talk about psychic things, you are talking about something that is dependent upon motion.
Well,
I
don't know.
I wanted to share a thought.
The making of an impression by seeing an object is not static. It's it's something that happens when you look at it. So it's not, you know. Anyway.
Izzadeen.
Yes, I just wanted to mention some thoughts that came in while we're in the course of this discussion. There's nothing. I don't use the application called TikTok, but I see a lot of references to it on television, and it seems to be a means of communicating mostly among younger people, but is different or is creative, and it seems to involve dance. It seems to involve poetry, singing, just straightforward teaching. But it seems like if they're going to be changes in how our language and how we use our language, it might come through something like a lot of people experimenting with this sort of TikTok type of.
Well, TikTok is by design, or at least what it's turned into anyway, performative. Performative,
yes. Expressive.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not usually through static things. No, it can be, of course,
but you know, there's you know, like everything else, higher and lower, there's ancient higher forms of performativity, and then there's lower modern forms of performativity. So, you know, the ancient forms would elevate us and the modern forms degrade us. And essentially, when Weizenbaum, the guy who created ELIZA, the original AI, when he created this, he thought it would be a tool to elevate it. And for the last 30 years or so, he was basically saying, you know what? No, it's actually making us dumber, and it's going to continue making us dumber. The AI is not going to come and kill us like in Terminator. It's just going to make us so dumb that we're incapable of doing anything without it.
Might make us dumb enough that we turn it into something it will terminate us.
Right, and that's the problem. There was another person saying that if we continue on the trajectory that we're on, we're essentially going to be reduced to communicating with ultra high-end computers through a series of gestures and grunts to get it to do what we want it to do.
Well, we might have a slightly larger repertory, but I get the point. We're already talking to computers. Try calling almost, you know, any business of any size, and you'll, find yourself talking to computers. I hate it, but that's what we're doing.
The worst part is going to be when we finally think that computers think.
Yeah, that's a fatal error. But we will fall into that error. I don't see how we'll.
I mean, that's where it's headed, and that's what concerns me more than anything else.
That's very concerning, and I think it is heading that way. And I don't think people don't know what thinking is, but they're going to know even less in the future.
I mean, if you take a piece of metal and a piece of wood and you forge out a hammerhead and you turn it into a hammer and you strike the hammer onto a nail, was it the intelligence of the hammer that made the nail go into the board? No.
That's right.
You've heard the old phrase that for a man with a hammer, everything becomes a nail.
Yeah, and for AI, everything becomes something soluble. That's a problem that's solvable by its internal processes. It's
I used to have arguments with people. This is like 30 years ago, who were computer people. Of course, I had to associate with computer people because I was one of them. But they believed that the machine thought.
Yeah, I know that's crazy.
Yeah.
Ever since I got involved with computers, I've had the view that finally they were going to do us in, that they would be our.
I just wanted to ask
you,
did people just say that computers thought as a kind of a hyperbole?
Well, sometimes.
Did they really believe that?
A lot of people for quite some time have believed that the computers have the capacity to think. Even if they don't have it today, they will sometime soon.
And that's where we're headed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem, is they believe that thought can be replicated in an electronic circuit.
And they believe that computers can actually be a form of life that once it achieves so-called intelligence is going to be worthy of rights and dignity and respect and so on and so forth. And that's just simply insane.
And then instead of having fights over abortion, we'll have fights over unplugging a computer.
Yes, we will have killed it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Yes, and
you will have killed an intelligent being if you unplug it.
That's a form of murder. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I don't know. It's kind of inevitable. I didn't see it at first, but once people started talking about the body in terms of mechanics and then the brain in terms of cybernetics, there was some explanatory power in some of those formulations, but they clearly open into a kind of reductionism that we may not survive.
Well, we a long time ago, we have already come to the conclusion that human beings are just a kind of machine.
Well,
and we treat them like a kind of machine as far as correcting their problems. Mm-hmm. And so now we're not very far from saying, well, they and the computer they are not superior to the computer. In fact, the computer is superior to them because it doesn't make mistakes.
It works better, right?
Right, and the tradition of thinking of people as machines goes back a long way. I mean, even past Descartes. I mean, really, in the Western tradition, a lot of it starts with the Stoics, then leads into Descartes and so on and so forth. But the difference is it was always a minority opinion.
And it was also a little bit more of an analogy rather than an identity.
It was, because someone like Descartes actually in his private life was, a professed, staunch, Catholic. And the difference now is starting in the 1970s, you actually had these ideas put forth that literally were nothing more than a machine that's an assembly of other machines.
Exactly.
And that's all we are. Nothing more, nothing less.
And it's not surprising that B.F. Skinner arose around that time.
Exactly. B.F. Skinner and Ayn Rand are two of the people that caused me to do something I normally wouldn't do in life, which is immediately stick the book in the trash can.
It took me a while to figure out that Ayn Rand was in that category, but
which book was that you threw in the trash?
B.F. Skinner's Walden 2 and Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. Those two books went immediately in the trash can after I was done reading them.
Yeah. I spent most of my career in computers, and a lot of it in the computer science department, working with people working on our artificial intelligence. And I remember there's a guy that was somewhat famous in our department, and I got into a discussion with him once, and he was insisting that, you know, there was no such thing as higher and lower, there were only increasing levels of complexity. And I thought, boy, you can't go very far with that, because things actually get simpler as you go higher. But I didn't tell him that. But, you know, that notion, I told him, well, you know, I wasn't absolutely convinced that, you know, evolution in the purely materialistic sense was true. And he almost had a fit.
Yes.
And I told him, well, it cannot be scientifically proven or disproven, but that didn't help him much.
They can't tolerate the idea that they've been believing in a falsehood.
Yeah, and that certain things are outside their world of understanding.
Right.
You know, that one reason why most people can't understand the ultimate things are because they think the ultimate things have to be of some sort of ultimate complexity, when in reality it's ultimate simplicity.
Exactly. They think that it gets more and more obscure, but it actually is, you know, I mean, once you see it, it's the most obvious thing. It's not obscure at all.
And in fact, if you look at the chain of being, the lower you go on the chain of being, the more complex things are.
Sure. I mean, look at the simplicity of hydrogen, then go all the way down into those heavy synthesized radioactive elements. And they get more and more complex, heavier and heavier, and more toxic for the most part.
They worship the complexity because it is in concordance with the reign of quantity.
Well, it's not just that. Well, they don't know that, but it's because you can have complexity by accumulating more information and more information, and that is seen as an accomplishment and the source of merit. And so, I mean, as long as you have to have more and refuse to see the beauty in less, you're off and running.
Well, and look to how I'll give 3 examples. The ultimate principle of the Platonists is called the One. The ultimate principle of the Confucians and Taoists is called the Tao, or the Way. And the ultimate principle of, you know, Pseudo-Dionysus and John Scotus Eriugena is called the Light. The Light, the Way, the One. Simple.
Yeah, really simple. What can you do with the One? What can you do with it? Make money with it. You know, that's why it's out of favor. Can't do anything with it.
You know, there was this old article from Kathleen Rain, to change the subject briefly, but to get to what we were talking about last week. This old article of Kathleen Rain that was out of print and really hard to find, and I managed to get it through the library. And, you know, there's this great line in there where she said, you know, she was visiting Ezra Pound at St. Elizabeth's, and she said that the guys there, you know, he's basically a saint or a prophet to be, you know, keeping his sanity in such an insane place. And, you know, he had to basically, they gave him a TV, and he said, yeah, they give all the inmates in televisions to drive them insane because their business is built on staying insane. So he smashed it and then used it as a bookcase. But she said that, you know, one of the things that she realized is, here he is. Why is this great poet talking so much about money and usury when he also could be talking about things like the One and the Light and stuff, which he talked about as well? And she realized, wait, this is important. There's only one thing that old carpenter from a couple thousand years ago got angry about, and it's money and usury.
Yeah.
In the tradition, he never has once got angry about anything other than that, which shows that there's a certain spiritual prerogative to, avoiding such things. So
when you avoid something that is counter to truth, you may have to act to push it away.
And another thing is there's a bunch of articles I sent Sidi Izzadeen on spiritual economics, and it's basically, part of this movement called for movement for degrowth, that essentially it says we should gradually, focus not on growing more economically, but growing negatively, because we've gotten to a point where, we actually have too much. And, we can always use science to foster things like medicine, but do we really need, a 10,000-second different kind of back scratcher?
Exactly.
Essentially, the way the monetary system functions right now, it is not focused on the benefit of humanity. It's focused on making the most profit. And so it's very detrimental to humanity, to the planet, to the animals. And the root of that, it's actually not technology or anything else. It's really comes down to two things: a lack of esoteric spiritual values and a willingness to subserve everything to the power of mammon, and it's not money, as Shaw would say, that's the root of all evil. It's money making money. It's greed. It's avarice.
Right. I understand that. We don't. Most of the things that people are making now, they really know that they're not good for people. They already know that. What they know also is that people can be led to want these things and to continue to want them, even though it is killing them.
Yeah. And in order to get them to want them, they have to lie to them.
And then we can make money off of it. And that's,
there's an inherent dishonesty in that. If you have to mislead people into thinking they need things they don't need.
Things that are actually quite possibly injurious to them.
Yeah, that's right.
Most of the manufactured foods that you go into the middle of a grocery store and you start looking at what's in them, I think that they are positively dangerous to humankind. And
some of them are.
And you know what? Another thing is that I believe that a lot of people from a few hundred years ago would not be duped by any of this. The thing is, I'm not saying that things were better then, but what I am saying is that, even if someone was illiterate and unschooled, or they went to some village school until they were 10 years old or whatever, the point is most people lived on a farm and got schooling in common sense. Unofficial schooling in common sense. And one of the primary roles of common sense is, if you don't need it, you don't need it, and take anyone from 300 years ago and ask them, here, you've got an unlimited amount of money. Do you want to get all of this stuff? That's stupid. Why do I need all of that junk and that clutter and everything? But the problem here is people are given so much education in applied things, math, science, etc., but no logic, no metaphysics, no critical thinking, and no practical skills. So people get into adulthood and they don't know how to live their lives, and they don't know how to restrain themselves when they're constantly bombarded with more and more advertising for things that are ostensibly supposed to make their lives better, but are just there to fill a void that is never going to be filled.
Yeah. And that's not just the reign of quantity, that's the reign of propaganda. As soon as the ad agencies started running everything. But reign of quantity is pertinent here because people used to know what enough was. I mean, most people did. And people in the past were almost reflexively distrustful about new things. And some of that was, maybe superstitious or just, or whatever, but the truth is there's some wisdom in that.
Right.
And the whole degrowth thing sounds to me like we need to make things better, not just more.
Right.
And if we
Right.
want more quality of life, we may have to shrink some quantity.
And think about it in the way the Amish did. People tend to think about the Amish in a very wrong way. They think every single Amish community is exactly the same and they're all radical, but a lot of them are not as radical. And particularly a lot of the communities, as I'm sure in City Talha in Indiana, they actually do adopt modern things, but they do it very selectively after a period of evaluation.
Exactly.
And so what I'm thinking is we could have a modernity that's based off the economics of someone like E.F. Schumacher. Small is beautiful. You look, say, oh, well, refrigeration, modern hygiene, vaccination, perhaps, could benefit society. Let's do it. Flat screen televisions don't really do any good for the world, so maybe we should, not produce them.
Yeah, they may save a little energy over the vacuum tube types, but
I meant get rid of televisions altogether.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we were fine before it came along, and we were fine for a little while after it came along, but it didn't take too long to cause trouble.
Yeah, but another thing that was probably beneficial at the beginning is it didn't suck people in as much because it was black and white and there was limited programming, and it wasn't immersive, and
it's fuzzy.
Back but I know my parents would tell me, even in the 50s and 60s, after 10 p.m. it would just shut down for the night. You'd just have like a blank screen or something. But then not long after that, it changed, and you'd have all night programming of different sorts.
I think once it got practical and inexpensive to record the video, they could play it all night. But I remember that the stations used to finish the 11 o'clock news, and some stations might have actually a brief religious program, and then they'd sign off with the national anthem.
That's right. And most of the people in their living rooms who were still awake would stand up with their hand over their chest.
Well, I never did that, but it was
a lot of people did. I knew a lot.
It was time. Well, that's all right. That's fine if they. I mean, I don't hold that against them, but that's a little Pavlovian sometimes. But I understand the
first got
sentiment.
In my town, they didn't even have programming. All they had was the test pattern.
Yeah.
And people went out and bought TVs, and they would look at the test pattern, and one was a picture of an Indian.
Yeah.
And one was a picture of something or other else. Yeah. And then they started showing these old B westerns, That was all they had. They didn't have any programming.
Well,
the test pattern was valuable, though, because in those days televisions were hard to adjust, and if you just waited until the station went off or switched to the test pattern, you could adjust the horizontal and vertical and distort and the whatever else in the picture.
I do wish that they actually taught proper history and politics in the schools here. So, for instance, What do they do? They very cursorily go through and be like, oh, we had this war, this war, this war. They were all evil forces and we all defeated them, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, no, everyone, you know, is like, oh, Thomas Jefferson, blah, 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 you know, Declaration of Independence. But if you actually went through, and I don't think anyone reads him anymore, but if you read Jefferson's letters, and if you read John Adams' letters and his diaries, and if you read the diaries of Martin Van Buren, you're going to realize that basically every principle that the country was founded on and lived by for the most part in the first, you know, 40, 50 years of its history has all been turned upside down, and this country is the opposite of what the founding fathers actually wanted. And the irony is that the people that talk the most about the founding fathers are the ones that the founding fathers would be most repulsed with.
I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that's true. I mean, honestly, we've got a Federalist society here, but if you actually wanted to read the Federalist papers and the writings of some of these founders, you would have an entirely different understanding of the country and the values that it is supposed to have.
Right.
They should teach it. They should teach, when they teach about Thomas Jefferson, they could give some of the ideas that he had, that he contributed. You know, you wouldn't have to assign all of Jefferson's letters, you know, for homework.
Right.
You know, you could bring him intellectually alive a little bit.